And ultimately, the world is moving so fast that we need to be self-taught. Again, I like what Aibrary is doing with Idea Twin. Human creativity is like the sun, producing sunlight. AI doesn't produce new knowledge. It's like the moon. It reflects the light from the sun, but it doesn't generate light itself. But the big win is in doing better things, not just doing things better.
Hi everyone, welcome to Aibrary interview episode. My name is Vivian, I'm the host today, and this is Professor Chris Dede. He's from Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Dede has been professor in Harvard Graduate School of Education for decades, and his research has a lot of innovative impact about cutting edge technologies, Gen AI, innovations, and learning as well. So we're very honored to have Professor Dede to become Aibrary's advisor to lead us through this journey about Gen AI and lifelong learning and also personalized learning. Very passionate to join Dr. Dede for this series today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you again.
So, Professor Dede, our first question is that you have been written about the 60-year curriculum. How did you define lifelong learning in today's world? You have argued that education has to be spread across a lifetime, not just front-loaded in use. So why this moment so different?
So to me, lifelong learning at this point in history is defined by three words: thriving on chaos. Now, a professor almost 40 years ago wrote a book called Thriving on Chaos for managers at that time. And thriving is really the important word because it's not surviving chaos or just doing okay during chaos. It's actually saying that chaos, which we tend to fear, can be empowering if you know how to take advantage of it. And that's why lifelong learning now is so important. In 2020, I wrote a co-edited book on new models of lifelong learning. And we began the book by saying that we were facing difficult times as a civilization, not just in 2020, but in 2030 and in 2040, and maybe even in 2050. In the book, we talked about climate change and failure to reach any of the UN sustainability goals, and technological economic disruptions like VR or the metaverse or biotechnology. Interestingly, since that book was written, we've had the pandemic, we've had Gen AI, and now we see globalization itself being destabilized by the rise of authoritarianism across different countries. So, if anything, our forecast that it was going to be a chaotic, disruptive, difficult time was too weak. There was a comparable time in history about a century ago, and in the United States it's called the Greatest Generation because between 1910 and 1960 they faced two world wars, a terrible pandemic after the First World War, the Great Depression, and then the beginning of the Cold War, all during half a century. For better or for worse, we're facing something similar. We can't afford to constantly be getting degrees and certificates, and ultimately, the world is moving so fast that we need to be self-taught. If you think that this sounds difficult, it's not easy, but actually, I'm unusual in that I held an endowed chair at Harvard for several decades in a field in which I had never taken a course. Not as an undergraduate, not as a graduate student, not after I became a professor. I basically had to teach myself the field that I taught at Harvard. That's not going to be unusual in a world that's moving this quickly. So lifelong learning, very, very important.
Awesome. I totally agree of that. And then I feel like today's century is rapidly growing. So there's no definition of when to stop, right? And then given that AI is having a lot of instructions and then there's no boundaries to get knowledge. So our motivations becomes different because you can get it from the machine directly. And now it depends people's motivation. So looking back, is there any experience that shaped your own journey as a lifelong learner?
Well, when I was in high school, I really wanted to go to the California Institute of Technology for college. At that time, it was the hardest college in the United States to get into, but I really wanted to. And I was in a not very good public high school, and I knew that Caltech required that you come in already knowing calculus. My high school didn't offer calculus. So I basically went to the library and self-taught myself calculus well enough, at least, to be able to get into Caltech. Then at Caltech, I majored in chemistry, but I felt that was a little narrow, and so I did a double major, and the other major was English. And people wondered why I was combining two things that were so different from one another, but actually for me, that was a strength. I was all set in graduate school to go on in chemistry, but then I really began to feel that education needed help. In fact, I didn't like education in high school or earlier, and so I wanted to see if I could help people to do better. So I switched into education, and then in the mid-1970s, when Apple came out with the initial microcomputer, I switched again into learning technologies. And that's a great field for me because I get bored easily. And so people who teach something where every year they teach exactly the same thing, I would go crazy doing that. But I've had to reinvent myself every couple of years because the learning technologies keep changing and shifting and morphing, and I have to change and shift and morph in response. So often in education, we're taught that what you want to be is narrow but deep. I'm not sure that that's true in the world as it exists today. I think that what might be better is, yes, to deeply understand one field, but at the same time, to be broader in terms of other kinds of knowledge that you accumulate, because that kind of knowledge can leverage you into making these sorts of transitions that I'm describing. So I've walked my talk in terms of lifetime learning.
That's very insightful. So how do our current education system match this reality?
So ironically, Harvard contributed the most troubling misconception about learning today, because in the 1940s, one of the professors here was B.F. Skinner, the founder of a school of psychology called behaviorism. And behaviorism had its strengths, but one of the things that it believed is that you can't learn anything complicated until you learn all the simple parts. Now that sounds like kind of common sense, and even today, 80-something years after behaviorism, many people still believe it. Our school system is still based around it. But what research since the 1940s shows is that it was wrong. Cognitivism, which is a theory of learning, constructivism is a theory of learning, situated learning is a theory of learning, and all of those say you can learn simple things while you're learning something complicated. And unlike learning all the simple stuff first, you're motivated to learn the simple things because you understand why they're important, because they're part of doing this complicated thing that you want to do. And you don't forget them because they're not decontextualized, but they're richly caught up in something that integrates them for you. So my colleagues and I developed a series of curricula that illustrated this idea of learning more than one thing at a time. And one of those curricula was called EcoMod. For third graders, we developed virtual ecosystems, kind of like the virtual worlds from games. And students in third grade would enter those virtual ecosystems through their computer interface, and they would learn many things at the same time. They'd learn ecosystem science, but they'd also be learning scientific inquiry because they had to figure out why the ecosystem was changing so quickly. And then because we thought that we could see how much we could get away with their learning, we also built in computer modeling so that they could model the behavior of animals in the ecosystem. And we gave all of that to third graders, and they learned all of it and wanted more. So they learned science, inquiry, computer modeling through immersion by doing, having beliefs and dispositions as part of all of that. And they learned better because all those things were together than they would have learned if they'd been separate and taught in little tiny pieces. So we really need to rethink behaviorism and simplicity in education and instead stop putting a glass ceiling over children's heads. So unfortunately, our current educational systems, and by that I mean from kindergarten all the way through the elite universities like Harvard and Stanford and Peking and so on, are still industrial era. If somebody 200 years ago were to time travel to the present and look around, they would find the modern world completely baffling, except schooling. Schooling would look very similar to how it looked 200 years ago. It's really industrial era. Mm-hmm. So when you're using an assembly line, as industry did in the industrial era, what you're doing is you process everything the same, and then some things come off the assembly line working well, and other things are misassembled, and you just toss them out. And you have high-stakes testing that focuses on things that are easy to measure, like is the alarm clock working or is the alarm clock not working, that you put together. So in industrial era learning, we process all students the same, but a lot of students don't learn because it's one size fits all. We measure only very simple things that are easy to measure, like whether you can answer multiple choice questions, but that's not what's important in life. And most of it is driven by the assessment system. So if you tell the head of a school or a university, ultimately you're going to be measured by whether or not your graduates do well on high-stakes tests, the Cow, the SAT, law school exams, medical school exams. That's what you're going to get, a curriculum that's just oriented towards taking tests. And teachers are really stuck because they're a little like a doctor who has a patient that's very ill, and whenever the doctor visits the patient, they can take measurements, but the rest of the time, they don't have lab tests they can use. They don't have any kind of diagnostic instruments they can leave and look later. And so there's no opportunity for formative insights and formative correction, and the patient lives or dies based on what the doctor does with only these direct measures. We have to move beyond this kind of industrial era education into something that's much more like the modern era, the knowledge-based era, in which people in workplace settings collaborate to solve problems that nobody's ever seen before.
Great comments about like assessment and assembly lines. So speaking of that, AI itself is part of what's changing the equation. How do you see that?
So AI is changing two big things about education. It's changing what outcomes we want, which not very many people are talking about, and it's changing how we teach, which is what a lot of people are talking about. So let's discuss outcomes first. I think not only about AI, but I think about IA, intelligence augmentation. IA is what happens when a human being and an AI work together, and each does what it does well. So what AI does well is something called reckoning, calculative prediction. And it's very good at taking in enormous amounts of data and coming up with insights from the data that it can communicate to the human being. So if you're a cancer doctor, your AI partner can look all across the world at online medical journals every morning and give you the latest information. It can look all across the world at online patient records every morning and give you insights that are happening from those similar cases. But it's the human being that understands many kinds of things that go beyond reckoning, calculative prediction. Human beings have what we might call practical wisdom. So human beings know that some people want quantity of life and others want quality of life. That what treatment you choose greatly affects your family. That there are cultural beliefs about death and spiritual beliefs about death, and so on. So you would always want the AI helping the human being, empowering the human being, rather than turning things over to the AI. Now, one thing we know about AI is that it does really well on the high-stakes tests. So if we prepare people to do well on high-stakes tests, we're training them to lose to AI when they graduate. What we need to do is to prepare them to do applied wisdom, the judgment side of the IA partnership. So another way to say that is that what we are spending time doing right now with AI in education is we're doing things better. Teachers are saying, look, I can make my PowerPoints faster, I can make my quizzes faster, I can do lesson plans faster. And there's nothing wrong with doing something more efficiently. But the big win is in doing better things, not just doing things better. What are the things that we can do now because we have AI that we couldn't do before? That's where the really big impact can come. As one example, I work in immersive authentic simulations, so that like the ecosystem in which students are able to learn by doing in something that simulates the real world, but they're also getting mentoring and assessment from the teacher in order to validate that they're doing well. Another kind of learning that really can be important is called metacognition. It's basically thinking about your own thinking. And one of the things that Aibrary does is they have a feature called the idea twin. The idea twin facilitates that kind of reflection. Many of us talk to ourselves. I know when I'm driving, I'll talk to myself sometimes. Nobody else is in the car, but I'm listening to myself think. And research has shown that that's really very valuable. What AI can do now is to capture our voice and then to have the AI using our voice talk to us. That's new, really, in history, and research needs to be done to establish just what it contributes. But it's very promising in terms of how it draws on different things that we know about the mind and the brain and learning. That's another example of doing things better rather than just doing better things. So changing outcomes and changing our processes is the promise that AI offers us.
Thank you so much for listing the examples and also telling us your perspective about AI and learning in this Gen AI era. Personalization is a crowded word. What makes for effective personalization? You have compared personalization to moving from a menu to a personal chef. So what does truly effective personalization look like in learning?
So the menu versus the chef really captures the heart of this. When you have a menu, basically you're making a forced choice among the things that are on the menu. When you have a personal chef, they come to you and say, what do you feel like eating? That's a really different situation. And too often in talking about personalization, people are really talking about adaptation. They're saying, well, it's personalized because if you get a question right, you get a harder question. If you get a question wrong, you get an easier question. That's personalization. No, that's adapting, which is part of it. But personalization also involves voice and choice. How are you learning and what are you learning should be partly your decision, not just the decision of the person that's giving you the menu. Also, too often people say, well, personalization means individual learning. You have that individual tutor that's the best way to learn. No, not really. There are some things that you can learn well with an individual tutor, but you certainly can't learn collaborative skills or the opportunity to synthesize multiple different people or leadership and other kinds of things that are truly important in workplace settings. So personalization means that you have different ways that you learn, maybe sometimes with a tutor, sometimes with a group of peers, sometimes in some other kind of format like learning by doing. I'm the Associate Director for Research of one of the 29 national AI institutes in the United States. 5 of the 29 are in education, and I'm in the one that is about adult learning and online education. So it's basically where Aibrary is centered. It's in workforce upskilling and reskilling and workforce entry as people prepared for the career they really want to have. Now, our institute, over the past 4 years, has built different kinds of AI-based tools to help people learn in a personalized way. So for example, one of the tools is called SMART. And SMART looks at an essay that you've drafted or some other kind of written document that you've drafted because your assignment was to do a paper or an essay or some other kind of written document. And it provides, as an AI, formative feedback. It doesn't write the paper for you. It doesn't provide the final grade because a human being's insights are needed to fully understand what you've written. But it provides intermediate feedback. It says, well, there's 6 things that should have been here and you've only got 4 of them. Or it says, well, you've got all 6 things that should be here, but you need to talk about how 2 and 4 are related. And that kind of intermediate feedback is a sort of personalization that it would be great if human teachers could do. But if you have 30 students in your class, there's no way that you can give that kind of individual feedback to each student. So that's one kind of personalization that we have right now with the kinds of tools that people like the institute I'm part of are building. But there's another frontier that I think is increasingly important and exciting. And that is, let's say that I have digital agents in several of the things that I'm taking. So here I am, I'm at a university, I'm taking a course in chemistry, I'm taking a course in engineering, I'm taking a course in history, and each of those has a digital teaching assistant that's helping the professor. And that digital teaching assistant is personalizing in the way that I talked about. It's looking at my essay and giving feedback. It's looking at other things I'm doing and giving feedback. What if those agents all talk to one another, not just inside of a course, but across courses? What if the history agent says, my student is really excited about this kind of thing in history, so when you're doing engineering, you should use examples that relate to something that that student is excited about. And by the way, the mathematics agent might say, well, that's true, but on the other hand, to do that kind of engineering, the mathematics is going to have to be stronger, and so we need to make sure that we build some motivation in to accomplish that. Now, if you can imagine a university where human teaching assistants do that, that would be even better, but they don't have the time. That's never going to happen. So having sort of a digital community where agents exchange insights about each human being to empower that human being to learn and to be motivated and to be assessed, that's a frontier for personalization that I think is reachable in the next 5 to 10 years. And what I like about initiatives like Aibrary is that having digital agents that you can trust, that preserve your privacy, but that also know a lot about you that they can communicate to other things that help you learn, is really an exciting opportunity to personalize deeper than we've ever been able to do so before.
Yes. Okay, great. To be honest, I've learned a lot. So we are also curious to know, what role should AI play in cultivating that kind of deep understanding?
So my colleague, David Perkins, here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, has a really powerful way of thinking about this. He says that if you can do something in the textbook, like calculate area for some image in the textbook, that's just learning a recipe. But if you can then take that formula and apply it in real life, that's deep understanding. So let's say that you have a sofa and you want to cover the cushion with a new kind of a cloth. It's an irregular cushion. It doesn't look anything like the picture in the textbook. That's simple. But if you really understand the formula, you know how to modify the formula. And anytime that you can go beyond just what you learned in the class and in the textbook to use it in a real life situation where you have to adapt it to that situation, that's understanding. And I think the distinction technically is called between what's called rote expertise, where you use a formula but you don't really understand how it works, and adaptive expertise, where because you understand how it works, you understand how to modify it.
For the next question, we're very curious, how can learner move beyond surface knowledge to achieve deep understanding?
So a lot of research has been done on what's called transfer, because Sometimes students get perfect grades in school and perfect test scores, but they go out into life and they fail because nothing looks like a test. Nothing looks like the textbook. Life is much more complicated than that. So transfer means that you understand something well enough to go through adapting it. How can you learn that? Well, you can learn that by practicing when you're facing different variations. Let me give you a specific example. My colleagues and I are working on a voluntary basis to help marginalized people like immigrants and people who are poor to learn negotiation, because they can't afford an expensive course from the Harvard Business School about how to learn negotiation. And one of the things that Gen AI makes possible now is to have a chatbot that acts like a landlord, or that acts like a used car dealer, or that acts like your boss when you want to get a raise. And you can practice with that chatbot. And then you can vary the chatbot. So after you're good at negotiating with a male boss, you try to negotiate with a woman boss. After you're good at negotiating with, the used car dealer who is really a nice person, you can practice with a used car dealer who really is kind of not such a nice person. And through that kind of variation in practice, you learn how to transfer the knowledge from a very specific but kind of simple situation into the full complexity of what we see in the world in terms of what's happening. One of the things I like about Aibrary is that it allows and enhances that kind of transfer because you have learning that takes place across different fields showing the relationships between them. So you have a book in one field, but then the next recommendation is a book in a different field, and you think, well, am I starting over? Is this just in a completely different direction? But then you find that actually it's an opportunity for transfer, to take the ideas from the first book and apply them in understanding the second book. And again, that scaffolds the kind of learning that you can do in the real world in terms of moving beyond surface knowledge to deep understanding.
That's very insightful. I do believe that deep understanding really connects with their personal journeys, and then people nowadays really need to use that upon to reflect on their personalized learning paths and journey paths, especially in their work and personal life. Yep. For the last question, you have said that AI should be an amplifier, not a replacement. What does that mean in practice for learners in everyday life?
So in education, often we focus on what we might call destinations. The teacher says to you, give me an essay, or give me a painting, or give me a historical analysis, give me a symphony. And those are destinations. And then you work to produce the destination and the teacher grades it. But the destination is really just what we call a proxy. It's sort of a second-hand way of saying you've learned how to take the journey that enabled you to write the essay or to do the symphony or so on. Now, what is concerning about the ways that people are using AI is that they're using it sometimes to short-circuit the journey. So the AI writes the essay or does the painting or produces the product in some substantial way. But because you haven't taken the journey, you haven't actually learned how to produce the object. I've read people who've argued that, well, human beings don't need to write anymore because AI is going to do the writing. But that's fundamentally silly, because if you think about what writing is taking your own original ideas and experiences, organizing them in your mind, learning how to make them compelling and interesting for other people, and contributing to knowledge. And if the AI does the writing, none of those things happen. You're just editing the AI. People say, well, students don't need to learn more than one language anymore because AI will do all the translating. Well, languages aren't just using different words to mean the same thing. Languages are ways of thinking that come out of culture and that come out of context. And so you're throwing away whole ways of thinking when you say, let's reduce everything to one kind of language that the AI is going to talk. So in developing tools or in developing educational sequences, AI can help, but not by short-circuiting the journey. Anytime that a person or a tool does your thinking for you when you're trying to learn something, you're in trouble. So that's why in the earlier examples that I gave of AI allowing you to practice a skill like negotiation, or AI allowing you to experience a role like ecosystem science in a virtual ecosystem, the AI is helping with the journey, but it's not short-circuiting the journey. The other thing that I would say about AI in knowledge creation is that if we graduate people from our educational systems who perfectly can mirror all the knowledge and skills that teachers want them to have, we're not succeeding. And the reason we're not succeeding is that those students don't know how to create new knowledge. As a professor, I see people go into doctoral programs. And there are a lot of people who do very well in doctoral programs as long as they're taking courses. And then they have to write a dissertation, and they're told your dissertation has to contribute to new knowledge. And they're stuck, because for the 20 years that they've been in the educational system, nobody ever asked them to produce new knowledge, and they don't know how to do it. So we need to think about how AI can help empower learners, not just to create effective understanding of knowledge and skills that the civilization already has, but how it can help with creating new knowledge. Again, I like what Aibrary is doing with Idea Twin and the virtual mentors like Nova, because we know that just experience alone isn't enough to accomplish knowledge creation. Yes, you get creative ideas out of experience, but you need guidance and mentoring in order to turn those creative ideas into something useful, rather than just being something kind of different and weird. And the mentor is also trying to take you on a journey from you're asking questions when you're just trying to understand an area, to being an explainer, because the best way to learn something is to teach it, and then ultimately to being a knowledge producer who can go beyond explaining to come up with new kinds of insights that are based on understanding. And that's something that's very important for us to accomplish. Human creativity is like the sun, producing sunlight. AI doesn't produce new knowledge. It's like the moon. It reflects the light from the sun, but it doesn't generate light itself. And we have to be careful not to dilute our sunlight with too much AI moonlight, because that's not going to help us develop the kind of knowledge and skills that we need, creative knowledge and skills, to overcome the difficult time that we're facing in our lifelong learning journey.
Great metaphor. Thank you so much. So if you have to leave learners with one message about the future of education, what will it be?
So almost 60 years ago, a man named John McHale wrote a book about the future of the future. And he coined a little saying, an epigram. The future of the past is in the future. The future of the present is in the past. The future of the future is in the present. Now let me disentangle that for you. The future of the past is in the future means that we're constantly reinterpreting the past, that we think we understand our past, and then something happens where we see it through a different light. We see oppression when we didn't see oppression. We see insight where we didn't see insight. And so the past is also constantly changing as we reinterpret it through the future. The future of the present is in the past. Well, the present flows from the past. It builds on the past. It's shaped by the past. And in fact, there's a saying, people who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Because if you don't understand how the past has created certain things that are less than good, you're going to fall into the same trap again if you don't understand the past. But then the future of the future is in the present. And what Mikhail meant by that is the same as the message from the movie The Terminator. No fate but what we make. So even though the past shapes the present, even though the past is interpreted through the future, ultimately it's in our hands. The best way to predict the future is to invent the future. And the best way to invent the future is to empower yourself through lifetime learning.
That's great. Thank you so much, Professor Dede. Really insightful feedback and powerful ideas about how lifelong learning should be and how we should think about lifelong learning in this Gen AI era. And I really like your ideas and comments about Aibrary, especially Idea Tween and Nova. We are launching our app starting at the end of September. If anyone that would like to try out lifelong learning, use your own AI avatar, feel free to subscribe us. Thank you so much.